the success should have been greeted with enthusiasm, but it was not.
People at the time really couldn't foresee what precision location would really mean for the U.S. military and how that would contribute to transforming armed conflict.
That lesson would be learned with the whole world watching as coalition troops prepared to battle the ground forces of Saddam Hussein in the closing hours of the Gulf War. In February 1991, after a punishing 5-week aerial bombardment, Gulf War generals were preparing to send ground forces into Iraq. Saddam was expecting his forces to be attacked from the sea and from over the border in Saudi Arabia.
The Iraqi army had gotten pretty heavily dug in all across southern Kuwait and Iraq. And so a ground campaign to move them out could have been a multi-month affair with fairly heavy casualties on the ground. What was needed was an alternative strategy.
General Schwarzkopf, the Joint Task Force commander, came up with a plan to do an enormous sidestep maneuver to avoid a direct assault into Kuwait.
Dubbed the left hook, it would start the ground war and attempt the first large-scale, deep desert advance in the history of warfare.
No one had ever invaded Iraq from the middle of the desert. There were trackless sands. One would get lost very quickly.
For the Iraqis, the only thing that could reliably cross this desert landscape were camels and camel trains. The notion that you could have hundreds of tanks going through at high speed in a coordinated fashion during night and day was just unimaginable to the Iraqis.
What Saddam and the Iraqis didn't know is that coalition troops had a new tool in their arsenal, GPS. In addition to its use for precision bombing, GPS had always been a tool for determining location. When Colonel Gaylord Green took over the GPS program in the 1980s, he spent years urging the military to embrace GPS for ground navigation.
In the beginning, people would ask, what does it do? And I said, well, it tells you where you are. And they would look at me and say, I know where I am. I don't need a satellite system to tell me where I am. And I say, well, you don't really know where you are.
Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and all of a sudden people start to realize how useful GPS could be.
But in 1991, the GPS constellation was not yet fully operational. Only 16 working satellites were in orbit, and the system called for 24. By repositioning satellites over the Gulf, they were able to get the coverage they needed.
But because GPS was not recognized before the war as being essentially a war-winning technology, very few receiver sets were actually available.
The few sets the military did have were distributed among troops as they waited to invade. At 4 a.m. on February 24th, the ground assault began.
Our maps looked like wallpaper. They had no detail on them. They just had latitude and longitude lines on them. So if you had one GPS receiver and say a whole company of tanks, that guy is the one they protected because he could tell them where they were.
GPS, along with night vision technology, allowed forces to advance day and night with unprecedented speed.
They could just barnstorm across the desert, and that really took the Iraqi army by surprise.
The ground war lasted just 100 hours. On February 28th, Kuwait was liberated.
The Iraqis, when they were negotiating the peace treaty, told the Americans they never go out there because they always get lost. How did you do that? And one of the generals held up a GPS receiver there to show this is how we did it.
an incredibly large multinational armored formation, was able to operate across what was perceived by the enemy to be a trackless desert and execute a strike that was one of the greatest maneuvers, I think, in the history of land warfare.
It takes a war some time to cement a concept or clarify its utility.
For Brad Parkinson, who staked his military career on bringing GPS to fruition, it was vindication.
The combination of precision bombing and emerging out of the desert at exactly where they thought they were coming out. It was kind of, yeah, now we get it. Now we get it.
It took nearly 20 years and a global conflict for the military to appreciate